The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Buckingham Palace like a shroud, wrapping the imposing structure in an ethereal veil that seemed to whisper of centuries past. Marcus Thompson adjusted his scarlet tunic with practiced precision, the brass buttons catching the first rays of dawn as he prepared for another day of service to the crown. At 28 years old, he had dedicated 6 years of his life to the elite Queen's Guard, a position that demanded unwavering discipline, absolute silence, and the kind of mental fortitude that could withstand the most challenging circumstances imaginable. The weight of his ceremonial rifle rested comfortably against his shoulder, a familiar companion that had become as much a part of him as his own heartbeat. The tourists hadn't yet arrived in their usual droves, leaving the courtyard in relative peace, save for the occasional early jogger or photographer hoping to capture the perfect shot of the changing guard ceremony. Marcus found solace in these quiet moments, when the world seemed to hold its breath and allow him to center himself for the day ahead. His mind wandered briefly to his childhood in Yorkshire, where his grandmother had regaled him with stories of royal pageantry and the honor that came with serving the monarchy. She had always spoken of the guards with reverence, describing them as living statues who embodied the very essence of British tradition and dignity. Those stories had planted the seeds of ambition in young Marcus, driving him through rigorous military training and ultimately leading him to this coveted position. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed across the courtyard, drawing Marcus's attention to a woman in her early 40s who walked with purpose toward the palace gates. Something in her gait suggested urgency, perhaps even distress, though from his position, he couldn't discern the specifics of her expression. She wore a simple dark coat over casual clothing, her hair slightly disheveled as if she had left home in haste. Most visitors to the palace carried cameras or guidebooks, eager to capture memories of their royal encounter. This woman carried nothing but determination and what appeared to be a crumpled piece of paper clutched tightly in her left hand. As she drew closer, Marcus could see the tension etched in her features. Her eyes, red-rimmed and puffy, suggested recent tears, while her jaw was set with the kind of resolve that comes from desperate circumstances. She approached the ornate iron gates with increasing urgency, her steps becoming more hurried with each passing second. The normal protocol would be for her to speak with the police officers stationed nearby, who would assess her situation and direct her accordingly. However, something about her demeanor suggested she might not follow conventional channels. Sarah Mitchell had spent the entire night pacing her small London flat, the letter from the housing authority crumpled and smoothed countless times as she wrestled with her options. The eviction notice gave her family just 7 days to vacate their home, a place where her children had grown up and where her late husband's memory still lingered in every corner. The previous day had brought a cascade of devastating news. Her application for emergency housing assistance had been denied, her employer had informed her of impending layoffs, and her youngest daughter Emma had suffered another asthma attack that required an expensive emergency room visit. In her desperation, Sarah had remembered reading about citizens who had successfully petitioned the royal family for assistance during times of crisis. While she understood that such interventions were rare and typically involved significant charitable organizations, she clung to the hope that someone, somewhere within those palace walls, might listen to her plea. She had written a heartfelt letter describing her family's situation, detailing how her husband's sudden death from cancer had left them financially devastated despite her best efforts to maintain stability. The letter spoke of her 14-year-old son James, who had been forced to take on adult responsibilities far too young, helping care for his sister while Sarah worked multiple jobs. It described Emma's medical needs and how the stress of potential homelessness was exacerbating her condition. Most importantly, it conveyed a mother's desperation and her willingness to do whatever necessary to protect her children's future. As Sarah approached the palace gates, her heart pounded with a mixture of hope and anxiety. She had rehearsed her approach countless times during the sleepless night, planning to respectfully request that her letter be delivered to someone who might have the authority to help. She understood that the guards were not typically the appropriate channel for such requests, but desperation had a way of making unconventional approaches seem reasonable. Marcus observed the woman's approach with growing concern. Her body language suggested someone in distress, and her direct path toward his position indicated she intended to interact with him directly. This presented a delicate situation, as his duty required maintaining his ceremonial stance while also being prepared to respond to potential security threats. The woman didn't appear dangerous, but appearances could be deceiving, and his training had taught him to remain vigilant regardless of circumstances. The early morning sun had begun to burn away the mist, revealing more clearly the woman's emotional state. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she reached the gates, and Marcus could see her lips moving as if she were rehearsing words she planned to speak. His heart stirred with unwanted sympathy, recognizing the universal language of human suffering even as his professional obligations demanded emotional detachment. Sarah reached the ornate gates and looked up at Marcus with pleading eyes. She could see his youth beneath the formal exterior, noting the kind eyes that seemed to acknowledge her distress even as his training required him to remain motionless. She approached slowly, respectfully, understanding that she was about to step outside normal protocol but driven by circumstances that felt anything but normal. The letter in her hand represented more than just words on paper. It was her family's lifeline, their last hope before facing the streets. She had spent hours crafting each sentence, trying to convey their desperate situation without sounding demanding or entitled. The letter included copies of medical records documenting Emma's condition, employment termination notices, and the housing authorities' denial of assistance. Every document told a piece of their story, painting a picture of a family that had exhausted all conventional avenues of support. Marcus watched as the woman stopped just outside the gates, her eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his stoic facade more challenging to maintain. She raised the letter slightly, as if preparing to speak, and he could see her gathering courage for whatever she planned to say. The situation was unprecedented in his experience, though his training had prepared him for various scenarios involving public interaction. The woman's voice, when she finally spoke, was barely above a whisper, yet it carried across the courtyard with startling clarity. Her words were respectful but urgent, explaining her situation with the kind of raw honesty that comes from having nothing left to lose. She spoke of her children, her late husband, and their impending homelessness with a dignity that remained intact despite her desperation. As Sarah spoke, Marcus felt his professional resolve being tested in ways his training hadn't fully prepared him for. Her story resonated with painful familiarity, reminding him of his own family's struggles when his father had been injured in an industrial accident. He remembered the fear in his mother's eyes during those uncertain months, the weight of responsibility that had settled on his young shoulders, and the overwhelming sense of helplessness that came with watching loved ones suffer. The letter she held contained more than just her family's story, it represented the stories of countless families facing similar crises throughout the country. Economic uncertainty, inadequate social support systems, and the crushing weight of medical expenses had created a perfect storm that left even hard-working families vulnerable to circumstances beyond their control. Sarah's situation was unfortunately not unique, but her courage in seeking help in such an unconventional manner set her apart from those who suffered in silence. Marcus remained perfectly still as required by his duty, but his mind raced with conflicting emotions. Protocol dictated that he should remain silent and motionless, directing the woman to speak with the appropriate authorities. However, something about her desperation and the genuine nature of her plea stirred something deep within him that transcended his professional obligations. The morning continued to unfold around them, with the usual sounds of London awakening serving as backdrop to this extraordinary moment. Traffic increased on the nearby streets, early commuters hurried past with their morning routines, and the palace staff began their daily preparations for the changing of the guard ceremony that would draw hundreds of visitors later in the day. Sarah continued speaking, her voice gaining strength as she detailed her family's situation. She spoke of her husband David, a construction worker whose cancer diagnosis had devastated their finances long before his death. She described the mounting medical bills, the lost income during his illness, and her efforts to maintain stability for their children during the most difficult period of their lives. Her words painted a picture of a family that had faced adversity with dignity and determination, only to find themselves overwhelmed by circumstances beyond their control. The desperation in her voice became more pronounced as she described their current situation. The eviction notice had arrived just as she thought they were beginning to stabilize their finances. Her part-time job as a cleaner barely covered their basic expenses, and Emma's medical needs required constant attention that made full-time employment challenging. The denial of emergency housing assistance had been their final blow, leaving them with no apparent options. Marcus listened to every word while maintaining his ceremonial stance, feeling the weight of her story settling in his chest like a physical burden. Her description of her children's fears and confusion struck him particularly hard, reminding him of his own siblings during their family's difficult times. He could imagine the sleepless nights Sarah must have endured, the weight of responsibility that pressed down on her shoulders, and the courage it had taken for her to come to the palace seeking help. The letter she held represented more than just a plea for assistance, it was a testament to a mother's love and determination. Sarah had exhausted every conventional avenue of support, from social services to charitable organizations, before turning to this unconventional approach. Her willingness to humble herself before the palace gates spoke to the depth of her desperation and the strength of her commitment to protecting her children. As the morning progressed, Marcus found himself hoping that someone in authority would emerge to address Sarah's situation. While he understood the limitations of royal intervention in individual cases, he also knew that the monarchy maintained various charitable initiatives designed to help citizens in crisis. Perhaps there was some mechanism through which Sarah's situation could be assessed and appropriate assistance provided. The sun continued its ascent, casting longer shadows across the courtyard and illuminating the intricate details of the palace architecture. The building stood as a symbol of British tradition and continuity, representing centuries of history and the enduring nature of the monarchy. For Sarah, however, it represented something more immediate and personal, a potential source of hope for her family's future. Marcus remained motionless, his training overriding his personal impulses even as his heart ached for the woman's situation. He understood that his role as a guard required him to maintain strict protocol, regardless of the emotional challenges presented by individual circumstances. However, he also recognized that Sarah's courage in approaching the palace deserved some form of acknowledgement, even if he couldn't provide the help she desperately needed. The story unfolding before the palace gates represented a collision between individual desperation and institutional protocol, between human need and ceremonial duty. Sarah's presence challenged the normal order of palace operations while highlighting the very real struggles facing ordinary citizens throughout the country. Her willingness to seek help in such a public forum spoke to both her desperation and her faith in the possibility of compassion from those in positions of power. As the morning continued, Marcus found himself hoping that this encounter would somehow lead to a positive outcome for Sarah and her family. While he couldn't break protocol to directly assist her, he silently wished that the right people would emerge to address her situation with the compassion and urgency it deserved. The letter in her hand contained more than just words, it held the hopes and fears of a family facing an uncertain future, and Marcus could only hope that someone with the authority to help would soon appear to receive it. The tension in the air grew thicker as Sarah's voice became more urgent, her words tumbling out faster as she realized that time was working against her. The palace grounds were beginning to show signs of increased activity, with staff members moving purposefully across the courtyard and the first tour groups of the day gathering near the entrance gates. Sarah knew that her window of opportunity was closing, that soon the area would be crowded with tourists and officials who might view her presence as disruptive. Marcus continued to maintain his ceremonial stance, though the internal struggle was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. Every fiber of his being wanted to acknowledge Sarah's distress, to offer some gesture of understanding or compassion. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory, reminding him that true service meant protecting not just the crown, but the people the crown represented. Yet his training demanded absolute adherence to protocol, regardless of personal feelings or circumstances. The letter in Sarah's hand had become increasingly wrinkled as her grip tightened with anxiety. She had begun to repeat certain details of her story, as if repetition might somehow increase the likelihood of her message being heard and understood. Her voice cracked slightly as she spoke of Emma's latest asthma attack, describing how her daughter had struggled to breathe while they sat in the emergency room waiting area, surrounded by other families facing their own crises. A palace security officer had begun to take notice of the situation, his attention drawn by Sarah's prolonged presence at the gates and her obvious distress. Officer James Hartwell, a veteran of 15 years with royal protection, approached the scene with practiced caution. He had dealt with countless situations involving members of the public seeking to interact with palace staff, and experience had taught him to assess each situation carefully before taking action. Sarah noticed the security officer's approach and felt her anxiety spike even higher. She understood that his presence likely signaled the end of her opportunity to deliver her letter, but desperation drove her to continue speaking, her words becoming more rapid and urgent. She began to plead directly with Marcus, her voice rising slightly as she begged him to at least accept her letter and ensure it reached someone who might be able to help her family. The security officer drew closer, his radio crackling softly with routine communications from other personnel around the palace grounds. Hartwell had observed the woman's approach and listened to portions of her plea, recognizing the genuine distress in her voice. However, protocol required him to intervene when members of the public attempted to engage directly with the ceremonial guards, regardless of the circumstances involved. Marcus felt sweat beginning to form beneath his ceremonial uniform despite the cool morning air. The approaching security officer represented the inevitable conclusion to this extraordinary encounter, but Marcus found himself silently willing the man to approach the situation with compassion rather than mere enforcement of protocol. Sarah's story had affected him deeply, stirring emotions that he had trained himself to suppress during his ceremonial duties. Sarah's voice became increasingly desperate as she noticed the security officer's approach. She turned briefly toward Hartwell, then back to Marcus, her eyes darting between them as she tried to gauge their intentions. The letter in her hand fluttered slightly in the morning breeze, its pages containing her family's hopes and fears in carefully written sentences that had taken her hours to compose. Officer Hartwell reached the scene and cleared his throat softly, preparing to address Sarah in accordance with standard protocols for such situations. He had dealt with hundreds of similar encounters over his career, though few had involved such obvious genuine distress. The woman's emotional state was clearly authentic, and her respectful demeanor suggested she posed no security threat to the palace or its personnel. Sarah turned to face the security officer directly, her eyes pleading for understanding even before he spoke. She clutched the letter to her chest protectively, as if preparing to defend her right to be heard. Her voice, when she spoke to Hartwell, carried the same desperate urgency that had characterized her plea to Marcus, but it was tempered with an understanding that she was likely facing the end of her unconventional attempt to seek help. The security officer's expression softened slightly as he took in Sarah's appearance and demeanor. Years of experience had taught him to distinguish between genuine distress and potential threats, and Sarah clearly fell into the former category. Her obvious desperation, combined with her respectful approach to the situation, presented him with a dilemma that went beyond standard protocol considerations. Marcus remained frozen in his ceremonial position, watching the interaction between Sarah and Officer Hartwell with intense interest. He found himself hoping that the security officer would find some way to address Sarah's situation compassionately, perhaps by connecting her with appropriate resources or ensuring that her letter reached someone who could provide guidance about available assistance programs. The morning sun had climbed higher in the sky, casting the entire scene in clearer light and highlighting the emotional intensity of the moment. The contrast between the formal grandeur of the palace setting and the raw human desperation of Sarah's situation created a poignant tableau that seemed to embody larger questions about institutional responsibility and individual need. Sarah began explaining her situation to Officer Hartwell with the same passion and urgency she had shown while addressing Marcus. She spoke of her children's faces when she had tried to explain their housing situation, of the fear in Emma's eyes when her breathing had become labored during her recent attack, and of James's premature transition into adult responsibilities. Her words painted a vivid picture of a family struggling to maintain dignity while facing circumstances that threatened to overwhelm them completely. Officer Hartwell listened carefully to Sarah's explanation, his professional demeanor gradually giving way to genuine concern. The details of her story resonated with his own understanding of the economic pressures facing many families throughout the country. His own sister had faced similar challenges following her husband's death, and he recognized the particular vulnerability of single mothers trying to navigate complex social service systems while caring for children with special needs. The letter Sarah held contained documentation that supported every aspect of her story. Medical records detailed Emma's ongoing treatment for asthma, including recent emergency room visits that had strained the family's already limited finances. Employment termination notices confirmed the loss of income that had precipitated their current crisis, while correspondence with the Housing Authority documented their unsuccessful attempts to secure emergency assistance. Marcus watched the exchange between Sarah and Officer Hartwell with growing tension. The security officer's body language suggested he was genuinely listening to Sarah's story rather than simply preparing to remove her from the premises. This gave Marcus hope that perhaps some form of assistance might be forthcoming, even if it couldn't come directly through his own intervention. The palace grounds continued to come alive around them as morning activities increased. Maintenance staff tended to the carefully manicured gardens, while administrative personnel moved between buildings with the purposeful efficiency that characterized royal household operations. The increasing activity served as a reminder that Sarah's presence was becoming more conspicuous and that a resolution to the situation would need to be reached soon. Sarah's voice began to show signs of strain as she continued explaining her family's circumstances to Officer Hartwell. The emotional weight of recounting their struggles, combined with the physical exhaustion of her sleepless night, was beginning to take its toll. However, her determination to be heard remained undiminished, driven by the knowledge that this might be her only opportunity to reach someone who could potentially help. Officer Hartwell found himself facing a situation that went beyond his usual protocols. While he had the authority to remove Sarah from the premises, her obvious desperation and the genuine nature of her circumstances suggested that a more compassionate approach might be warranted. His experience had taught him that sometimes the most effective way to maintain security was to address underlying problems rather than simply enforcing surface-level compliance. The security officer glanced briefly at Marcus, noting the guard's obvious tension despite his continued adherence to ceremonial protocols. Hartwell recognized the internal struggle that Marcus must be experiencing, having witnessed similar situations where guards were forced to remain motionless while observing human drama unfold before them. The emotional toll of such encounters was one of the hidden challenges of ceremonial duty. Sarah noticed the brief exchange of glances between the two men and felt a flicker of hope that perhaps they might find some way to help her, even if it wasn't through conventional channels. She had come to the palace as a last resort, understanding that her approach was unconventional but driven by circumstances that demanded extraordinary measures. Her willingness to humble herself in such a public setting demonstrated the depth of her commitment to protecting her children's welfare. The morning breeze carried with it the sounds of London awakening fully to the new day. Traffic increased on the nearby streets, while pedestrians hurried past on their way to work or other obligations. The normalcy of life continuing around them served as a stark reminder of how individual crises could unfold against the backdrop of routine daily existence, often invisible to those not directly affected. Officer Hartwell's radio crackled again with routine communications from other security personnel, reminding him that he had responsibilities beyond this single interaction. However, something about Sarah's situation compelled him to seek a solution that went beyond simple removal from the premises. His years of experience had taught him that genuine problems required thoughtful responses, even when they fell outside normal operational parameters. Sarah's desperation became more evident as she sensed the conversation drawing toward a conclusion. She clutched the letter more tightly, as if physical possession of the document somehow increased its power to help her family. Her voice took on a pleading quality as she emphasized her children's innocence in their current situation and her willingness to accept any form of guidance or assistance that might be available. Marcus remained locked in his ceremonial stance, but his eyes reflected the emotional impact of witnessing Sarah's struggle. The irony of his position was not lost on him, trained to protect and serve, yet bound by protocol that prevented him from offering direct assistance to someone clearly in need. The internal conflict generated by this contradiction created a tension that would stay with him long after the encounter concluded. The increasing activity around the palace grounds meant that their unusual conversation was beginning to attract attention from other personnel and early visitors. Officer Hartwell recognized that a decision needed to be made soon, either to direct Sarah toward appropriate channels for assistance or to ask her to leave the premises. The visibility of the situation added pressure to find a resolution that balanced compassion with operational requirements. Sarah seemed to sense the approaching conclusion of their interaction and made one final, passionate appeal. She spoke directly to both men, acknowledging their constraints while emphasizing the desperate nature of her family's situation. Her words carried the weight of a mother's love and the urgency of circumstances that threatened to overwhelm everything she had worked to build for her children. The letter she held contained more than just her family's story. It represented her faith in the possibility of institutional compassion and her belief that somewhere within the formal structures of society, there might be people willing to help those facing impossible circumstances. Her presence at the palace gates challenged the normal boundaries between public need and official protocol, creating a moment that would test the humanity of those sworn to serve. Officer Hartwell stood for a moment in contemplative silence, weighing his options as he observed Sarah's mounting desperation. His radio buzzed softly with routine check-ins from other security personnel, but his attention remained focused on the woman before him whose story had genuinely affected his professional judgment. Years of training had taught him to maintain emotional distance from such situations, yet something about Sarah's authentic distress and the specific details of her family's crisis penetrated his usual defenses. Sarah watched Hartwell's face intently, searching for any sign of compassion or understanding that might indicate a willingness to help rather than simply remove her from the premises. Her grip on the letter had become almost desperate, knuckles white with tension as she waited for his response. The document represented more than just her family's story, it was her final attempt to find help before facing the devastating reality of homelessness with her children. Marcus remained locked in his ceremonial position, though every muscle in his body seemed coiled with tension. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the courtyard and illuminating the intricate details of his uniform with almost painful clarity. He could feel sweat forming beneath his ceremonial bearskin hat, though whether from the warming air or emotional stress, he couldn't be certain. The security officer finally spoke, his voice carrying a gentleness that surprised both Sarah and Marcus. Rather than immediately directing her to leave, Hartwell acknowledged the genuine nature of her circumstances and expressed understanding of the desperation that had brought her to seek help in such an unconventional manner. His words carried the weight of personal experience, suggesting that he had encountered similar situations in his own life or through his professional duties. Sarah's eyes filled with fresh tears at this unexpected show of compassion, though she struggled to maintain her composure as Hartwell continued speaking. He explained the limitations of what could be accomplished through direct intervention at the palace, but also mentioned various charitable organizations and support services that might be better positioned to address her family's immediate needs. His tone suggested genuine concern rather than mere professional obligation. However, as Officer Hartwell reached for his radio to potentially contact someone who might provide additional guidance, the situation took an unexpected turn. Sarah's emotional state, which had been precariously balanced between hope and despair throughout the morning, suddenly shifted towards something darker and more volatile. The combination of sleepless nights, mounting financial pressure, and the stress of her unconventional approach to seeking help had pushed her psychological resources to their absolute limit. The trigger for this dramatic shift was subtle but significant. As Hartwell spoke about alternative resources and support services, Sarah's mind flashed to all the agencies she had already contacted, all the applications that had been denied, all the phone calls that had led to dead ends. The suggestion that she pursue yet another round of bureaucratic processes when her family faced eviction in just 6 days felt like a dismissal of the urgency of her situation. Marcus noticed the change in Sarah's demeanor immediately, though his ceremonial position prevented him from taking any preemptive action. Her posture shifted from pleading to defensive, while her grip on the letter tightened even further. The desperation in her eyes took on a harder edge, reflecting the transformation from hope to frustration that was occurring within her overwhelmed psyche. Sarah's voice, when she responded to Officer Hartwell's suggestions, carried a bitter edge that hadn't been present before. She spoke of the countless hours she had spent on hold with various agencies, the forms she had completed only to be told she didn't qualify for assistance, and the caseworkers who had treated her family's crisis as just another file to be processed. Her words revealed the depth of her disillusionment with systems that were supposed to help but had instead created additional barriers. Officer Hartwell recognized the warning signs of someone whose emotional reserves were dangerously depleted. His training had included dealing with individuals under extreme stress, and he could see that Sarah was approaching a breaking point. However, his attempt to de-escalate the situation by speaking in calming tones only seemed to intensify her frustration, as she interpreted his measured responses as further evidence that no one was truly listening to her family's plight. The transformation in Sarah's emotional state reflected the complex psychology of desperation. After maintaining composure through months of mounting crises, the combination of hope and subsequent disappointment at the palace had pushed her beyond her normal coping mechanisms. The letter in her hand, which had represented salvation just moments before, now felt like another futile gesture in a world that seemed systematically designed to ignore her family's needs. Marcus watched with growing alarm as Sarah's body language became increasingly agitated. Her voice rose in volume and intensity as she recounted her experiences with various social service agencies, each failed attempt adding fuel to her mounting frustration. The respectful, pleading tone that had characterized her earlier communications had given way to something rawer and more desperate. The palace grounds around them had grown busier as the morning progressed, with more staff members and early tourists beginning to take notice of the unusual scene unfolding at the gates. The increased visibility of the situation added pressure on Officer Hartwell to resolve matters quickly, while also making Sarah more acutely aware that her private desperation was becoming a public spectacle. Sarah's emotional breakdown manifested as a combination of grief, anger, and overwhelming helplessness. She spoke of lying awake at night listening to Emma's labored breathing, of watching James try to comfort his sister while carrying burdens no 14-year-old should have to bear, and of the crushing weight of knowing she was failing to protect the children who depended on her completely. These admissions came tumbling out in a torrent of pain that had been carefully contained for months. Officer Hartwell attempted to maintain professional calm while dealing with Sarah's escalating emotional state. His experience with crisis intervention told him that allowing her to express her frustration might be therapeutic, but the public nature of their location and the increasing attention from bystanders meant that the situation needed to be managed carefully. He found himself walking a delicate line between compassion and operational necessity. The security officer's radio continued to crackle with routine communications, serving as a constant reminder of his other responsibilities while he dealt with this unexpected human drama. Other personnel were beginning to inquire about the situation, as Sarah's raised voice and obvious distress had begun to draw attention from various quarters of the palace operation. Marcus felt his ceremonial composure being tested in ways his training had never anticipated. The woman's pain was palpable and authentic, creating an emotional resonance that challenged his ability to maintain the stoic demeanor required by his position. His grandmother's stories about the honor of serving others seemed to mock him as he stood helplessly watching someone in genuine need struggle with circumstances beyond her control. Sarah's frustration reached a crescendo as she spoke about the inadequacy of the systems designed to help families like hers. Her voice cracked with emotion as she described waiting rooms filled with other desperate families, caseworkers who seemed more concerned with paperwork than human suffering, and policies that seemed designed to exclude rather than include those most in need of assistance. The letter in Sarah's hand had become increasingly crumpled during her emotional outburst, its carefully prepared pages now bearing the physical evidence of her mounting desperation. The document represented hours of meticulous preparation and desperate hope, but now felt inadequate to convey the full scope of her family's crisis and her own psychological breaking point. Officer Hartwell recognized that the situation was moving beyond his ability to manage through conventional de-escalation techniques. Sarah's emotional state had deteriorated to a point where rational discussion was becoming increasingly difficult, while the growing attention from palace staff and visitors meant that more direct intervention might soon become necessary. The morning air seemed to vibrate with tension as Sarah's voice continued to rise, her words becoming less coherent as raw emotion overwhelmed her attempts at reasoned communication. The composed, respectful woman who had first approached the gates had given way to someone whose psychological defenses had been completely overwhelmed by the accumulated stress of her family's circumstances. Marcus remained frozen in position, though his eyes reflected the internal struggle between duty and human compassion that was tearing at his professional resolve. The irony of his situation, trained to protect and serve while being unable to offer comfort to someone in obvious distress, created a psychological tension that would haunt him long after this encounter concluded. Sarah's emotional breakdown represented more than just individual crisis, it reflected the broader challenges facing families throughout the country who found themselves caught between economic uncertainty and inadequate support systems. Her presence at the palace gates had transformed from a simple plea for help into a symbol of the gap between institutional protocol and human need. The increasing volume of Sarah's distress began to attract attention from other areas of the palace grounds. Staff members emerged from nearby buildings, while early tourists began to gather at a respectful distance, uncertain whether they were witnessing a security incident or some form of public demonstration. The situation was rapidly evolving beyond a simple interaction between individuals into something that required broader institutional response. Officer Hartwell's attempts to calm Sarah through verbal reassurance were proving ineffective as her emotional state continued to deteriorate. Her responses to his questions became increasingly erratic, jumping between different aspects of her family's crisis without logical connection. The careful narrative she had presented earlier had given way to a stream of consciousness expression of accumulated pain and frustration. The transformation in Sarah's behavior represented the complex interplay between hope and despair that characterizes extreme desperation. Her morning had begun with cautious optimism that perhaps unconventional approaches might yield different results, but the reality of continued systematic barriers had triggered a psychological response that bypassed her normal emotional controls. Marcus found himself witnessing the human cost of policies and procedures that, while necessary for institutional function, sometimes failed to account for individual circumstances that fell outside normal parameters. Sarah's story represented countless similar situations that never reached public attention, families who struggled in silence rather than seeking help through unconventional channels that might attract unwanted scrutiny. The breaking point arrived with devastating suddenness. Sarah's emotional control, stretched beyond its limits by months of accumulated stress and the morning's disappointing encounter with institutional barriers, finally snapped completely. Her voice rose to a pitch that carried clearly across the palace courtyard, drawing startled attention from everyone within earshot. The transformation was shocking in its intensity, as the respectful, pleading woman of earlier moments gave way to someone whose psychological defenses had been utterly overwhelmed. Officer Hartwell recognized the signs of complete emotional breakdown and immediately shifted into crisis intervention mode. His radio crackled to life as he called for additional support, understanding that the situation had moved beyond what he could manage alone. However, his attempt to summon backup only seemed to further agitate Sarah, who interpreted the action as evidence that her desperate plea was being treated as a security threat rather than a humanitarian crisis. Marcus watched in horror as Sarah's desperation transformed into something approaching rage. Her carefully clutched letter became a weapon of frustration, waved in the air as she directed her mounting anger toward the systems that had failed her family and, increasingly, toward the representatives of those systems who stood before her. The ceremonial guard found himself becoming the unwitting target of fury that had been building for months. The crowd that had begun to gather maintained a respectful distance, unsure whether they were witnessing a mental health crisis, a security incident, or some form of political demonstration. Early tourists raised phones to capture what they perceived as an unusual spectacle, while palace staff members emerged from nearby buildings to assess the developing situation. The private nature of Sarah's family crisis was rapidly becoming a public drama with far-reaching implications. Sarah's words became increasingly accusatory as she directed her frustration toward Marcus, despite his obvious inability to respond or intervene. Her anger focused on what she perceived as the cruel irony of seeking help from an institution dedicated to service while being met with silent indifference. The guard's ceremonial stillness, which protocol demanded he maintain regardless of circumstances, became a symbol of institutional callousness in Sarah's overwhelmed psyche. The psychological dynamics of the situation had become dangerously volatile. Sarah's mental state reflected the compound trauma of losing her husband, facing financial ruin, watching her children suffer, and encountering repeated systemic failures when seeking assistance. The morning's encounter at the palace had represented her last hope for intervention, and its apparent failure triggered a complete psychological collapse that manifested as misdirected rage. Officer Hartwell attempted to position himself between Sarah and Marcus, recognizing that the guard's inability to respond was inflaming rather than defusing the situation. However, Sarah's focus